Delegations from 50 African countries are gathering in Beijing for a three-day summit. Beijing is expected to urge the leaders to import more Chinese goods in exchange for additional loans and investment. It comes as the US, Europe and Canada impose hefty tariffs on Chinese imports, including electric cars. China's political influence in Africa has increased with its funding of big infrastructure projects such as railway lines and roads and power plants. But at least 9 countries are struggling with debt, in part because they owe money to China. Despite that, researchers in the US say that African nations are still willing to borrow Chinese money. Last year, China gave out loans of more than $4.6 billion. That's the highest amount since 2019. The International Monetary Fund says African economies will grow at 4% this year. That will make the continent the second fastest growing economic region in the world after Asia. Beijing's facing tariffs on Chinese goods exported to the West, and it's keen to boost trade with Africa. It says it wants to put more money into so-called green technologies and less into big infrastructure projects. David Monnier is the director of the Center for Africa and China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. He's joining us now from Beijing. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. China, obviously, as we were talking about, facing sanctions and tariffs on much of its exports. Bank of America, I see this morning, has cut China's 2024 GDP growth forecast to 4.8% from 5%. It does sound like China needs Africa at least as much as Africa needs China.
Yeah, indeed. I think we also see with the geopolitics attention, particularly in the United States and China shifting its focus much more trade with the global South, and Africa constitutes the bulk of global South. And I think the two need each other. I think for Africa, it brings more investment. China brings more investment onto the continent and attracts other investors from Europe and other parts of the world. And therefore, Africa, with 1.3 billion people, youthful, as well as the critical minerals, which the EVs that you mentioned depend on lithium batteries. And Africa is one of the major suppliers of that.
It's been reported in the past that Chinese projects, certainly the large-scale ones, tend to use mainly Chinese labor and Chinese equipment, often using materials supplied by China. Do these projects actually give African nations as much of a benefit as they might have hoped?
I think there's a lot of tension between the West and China in their competition to have access to Africa. For most Western countries, Africa was their territory based on the colonial history, and therefore I think China's making major inroads. It has upset the hegemonic Western countries. Africa and China have indeed issues that they are discussing in terms of trade balance in favor of China. However, some of the issues which are seen as major seem not to be really the core issues, such as claims that there are Chinese workers on the African continent. There's no evidence of that. I think at the highest level in most of these major projects, indeed, is led by Chinese, but ordinary workers remain Africans across the continent. I think the challenge that Africans have is some, not all, out of 54 countries, some do not have the capacity to negotiate fairly some of the deals, and others are doing extremely well. So it really depends with the country.
Just briefly, I want to ask you about security, which is becoming an increasingly important issue between African nations and China. I've just seen this morning that there's a joint statement from China and Nigeria saying that they're going to work together to maintain peace, security and stability in areas like the Sahel, the Gulf of Guinea and other regions. Are we going to see an increasing amount of Chinese military personnel or security personnel in regions like this? Just briefly, if you don't mind, sir, I'm afraid time is against us.
Or indeed, I think security affects everyone in the Sahel. Major companies, whether from China or Western world, do indeed face major security threats. And China does employ its own security for its own people. And the African Union, as well as regional bodies, are working extremely hard to ensure that they clear the security issues and other regulatory framework, including anti-corruption, which is a major challenge on the African continent.
David Monnier, we appreciate you being with us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Most welcome.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.